The tribunal ship's observation chamber had no windows in the human sense. Ellison stood before a wall of responsive material that interpreted electromagnetic data and rendered it into visual approximations her neural architecture could process. She had stood in similar chambers on 43 previous assignments, observing 43 different species at various stages of development or decline. She had delivered 43 judgments, each one filed, archived, accepted without question. This would be the 44th. Her dermal layer shifted slightly, adjusting to the chamber's controlled atmosphere. The sensation registered as neither comfort nor discomfort. Her people had evolved past such binary categorizations. Everything existed in a state of optimal equilibrium, including her own physical responses to environmental stimuli. The planet below showed patterns her instruments classified as chaotic, weather systems that refused stable prediction, ocean chemistry that fluctuated outside established parameters, land masses still adjusting from whatever tectonic events had accompanied the atmospheric cascade. Her people's models had predicted complete biosphere collapse within 18 months of first contact. That had been 4 years ago. Ellison's assignment brief appeared in her peripheral processing. Assess remaining human population, determine viability without intervention, recommend preservation protocols or independent designation. The text carried no emotional inflection, no suggestion of preference. Her role was observation, analysis, classification. She had performed these functions with consistent accuracy across 4 decades of service. She initiated descent protocols without hesitation. The settlement appeared at dawn, a collection of structures that her analysis identified as temporary, despite having existed for several years. Humans built impermanently, she had noted in previous encounters with the species. They seemed to anticipate change even when their technology suggested permanence. The reclamation zone stretched along a coastline where the ocean met land in a series of tidal pools that glowed faintly with bioluminescent organisms. Her briefing files indicated these pools sustained the settlement's primary protein source through algae cultivation that shouldn't have been biochemically viable for human consumption. She found him there as the sun broke the horizon, his hands moving through the water with a rhythm her sensors struggled to categorize. Dr. Ellison Hayes, the files designated him, former marine biologist, current keeper of knowledge that kept approximately 200 humans alive, in conditions that should have been uninhabitable. He looked up when she approached, and something in that immediate awareness made her dermal layer contract slightly. Humans had always watched her people with attention that felt too specific, as though they perceived something her instruments couldn't measure. "They sent an evaluator," he said. His voice carried frequencies her translator flagged as significant, without providing adequate interpretation. She confirmed his observation with the minimal response protocol required. Her form had been configured to approximate human proportions, though her dermal layer remained semi-permeable, exchanging chemical information with the environment. It should have provided optimal conditions for observation while maintaining necessary analytical distance. But standing near him, she registered sensory data that fell outside her standard parameters. He radiated heat in patterns that suggested inefficient metabolism, yet something in the rhythm of that heat, pulse, respiration, neural discharge, created organized complexity, her instruments interpreted as intentional rather than chaotic. "You've been watching the cultivation pools," he said, returning his attention to the water. "The algae strains shouldn't work. Your people's analysis would have told you that." "The biochemistry presents anomalies," she confirmed. "We present anomalies." He lifted a handful of the bright green biomass, water streaming between his fingers. "Your models didn't predict we'd still be here." She had no response that wouldn't constitute premature judgment, so she remained silent. He seemed to accept this, gesturing toward the cultivation frames that extended into deeper water. "If you're here to observe, you should understand what you're looking at." The settlement's other inhabitants moved through their routines with practiced efficiency. Ellison documented resource distribution, social hierarchies, conflict resolution mechanisms. Everything aligned with expected patterns for a population under extreme resource stress, except for the absence of the violence and desperation her species models predicted as inevitable at this stage of collapse. They had gathered in what her analysis identified as a communal eating area, sharing portions of food that seemed deliberately insufficient. Yet the gathering served functions beyond nutritional intake, information exchange, social bonding, reinforcement of group cohesion, through physical proximity and vocal interaction. Ellison participated from the periphery, answering questions about water quality and harvest timing, but not engaging in the casual physical contact that characterized the others' interactions. Vin found herself gravitating toward the same outer edge, close enough to document behaviors but maintaining analytical separation. "They rely on you," she observed during one of these gatherings, her voice low enough that only he would register it clearly. "They rely on patterns," he corrected. "I just happen to recognize them faster than most." "Because of your training. Because I spent 30 years studying systems that most people thought were too complex to understand." He paused, his attention on a group of children playing near the water's edge. "Turns out humans are pretty good at adapting when the alternative is extinction." She had been documenting this adaptation. 17 distinct cellular modifications that violated standard evolutionary timelines. Her xenobiologists had submitted preliminary theories, but none adequately explained the speed or specificity of the changes. Humanity was rewriting its own biology in real time. "Your people offered relocation," he said, still watching the children. "Controlled environments, managed reproduction. Guaranteed survival. 97% refused. Because guaranteed survival isn't the same as living." He turned toward her then, and the directness of his attention made her dermal layer respond with minute fluctuations she couldn't quite classify. "Your species chose certainty. We chose chaos. Neither of us knows yet which choice was right." On the 7th day of observation, Ellison invited her into the cultivation pools. "If you're going to understand what we're doing, you need to feel it," he said, already waist-deep in the water. Her form wasn't designed for aquatic environments, but her dermal layer could adapt to brief immersion. She moved carefully down the rocky slope, her sensors adjusting to the temperature differential, the chemical composition, the movement of water against her approximation of skin. He guided her hands beneath the surface, positioning her fingers against the cultivation frames. "Healthy biomass has a specific texture. Degraded material feels different. Your instruments can probably measure the distinction, but you need to know it here." He pressed her palm more firmly against the frame. The contact was brief, functional, but her sensory nodes registered more than biochemical data. The calluses on his palms, the controlled strength in his grip, the warmth of his skin even through the cool water. Something in her processing architecture flagged the interaction as significant without providing classification. "The filaments need to be separated daily," he continued, his focus on the delicate structures they were handling. "If you wait too long, they tangle and die. If you separate them too early, they won't have established sufficient anchorage." She processed the information, her hands moving under his guidance. The water carried vibrations, his heartbeat, his breathing, microscopic movements that created patterns her instruments struggled to categorize. "Your people must find us incomprehensible," he said quietly. "The way we cling to this, the refusal to accept what you're offering." She had explained the tribunal's position multiple times: preservation, study, controlled environments that would eliminate all the cascading failures that plagued this damaged world. The offer was logical, generous by any measure. "We document," she replied, using the formal plural her language required for official statements. "We do not presume to comprehend." His laugh was brief, almost silent, but she felt it through the water between them, a vibration that traveled up her arms and registered in her sensory nodes with unexpected clarity. "That's almost honest," he said. The settlement's evening gatherings became part of her observation routine. Humans seemed to require social aggregation, even when resources were scarce, perhaps especially then. They shared food in portions that seemed deliberately insufficient, accompanied by exchanges of narrative and physical contact that her analysis classified as socially cohesive but emotionally inefficient. Ellison participated but remained peripheral, and Vin found herself gravitating toward the same outer edge of the gathering. She told herself it was optimal positioning for observation, that the proximity to him didn't alter her data collection protocols, until the night he sat beside her on the weathered stone wall overlooking the ocean, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body against her dermal layer. Neither spoke for a long interval. The darkness was profound, the settlement's power reserves too precious for ambient lighting. Above them, stars her people had catalogued centuries ago, formed patterns humans had named without instrumental precision. "What are you really measuring?" he asked finally. "When you watch us." Her prepared responses felt inadequate. She was measuring survival capacity, technological aptitude, social cohesion, biological viability. But beneath those formal categories, she had begun registering other data. The way humans touched each other during conversation. Brief contacts that seemed to communicate volumes her language couldn't pass. The way Ellison's breathing changed when he worked with living systems, becoming synchronized with rhythms her instruments could barely detect. "Resilience," she said, choosing the term that encompassed most, without revealing the patterns she could not yet interpret. He turned toward her, and even in the darkness, she could sense the focus of his gaze. "And what have you concluded?" She should have maintained protocol distance. The tribunal had clear standards about emotional contamination of observational data, but something in her processing had shifted during these weeks of proximity. Exposure to the way he inhabited his damaged world without despair or denial, the quiet competence of his adaptation. "That your species possesses capacities we failed to predict," she said. "That our models may have fundamental gaps." His hand moved in the darkness, finding hers on the stone between them. The contact was deliberate, careful, giving her time to withdraw. She did not. His palm was warm, slightly rough, alive with minute tremors she recognized as pulse and neural activity. Her sensory nodes extended involuntarily, mapping the contact point, the chemical signatures of his skin, the electromagnetic patterns his nervous system generated. Something in her processing architecture flagged this as a violation of observational protocols. But she did not withdraw her hand. She began arriving at the cultivation pools before dawn, timing that had no analytical justification, but which she did not question. Ellison was already there, his hands moving through the water with the same practiced efficiency, and he never commented on her increasingly early arrivals. They worked in silence mostly, her hands learning the textures he had taught her, her senses adjusting to the rhythms of the living systems they tended. Sometimes he explained the patterns he was monitoring, temperature fluctuations, pH variations, the subtle signs of stress or thriving in the algae strains. Sometimes they simply moved through the routine together, their proximity creating data streams her instruments couldn't adequately classify. "Oh, you're not just observing anymore," he said one morning, his voice quiet against the sound of water. She should have corrected this assessment. Her presence in the pools served observational purposes, understanding human interaction with their environment, documenting adaptation strategies. But her hands were in the water beside his, separating filaments with care she had learned from watching him, and the explanation felt incomplete. "I'm documenting cultivation techniques," she said. "You're participating." He glanced at her, water dripping from his fingers. "There's a difference." Her dermal layer responded with fluctuations she was beginning to recognize as something her people's language had no adequate term for. Not quite discomfort, not quite pleasure. Something that existed in the space between certainty and chaos. "Does the distinction matter?" she asked. "To your tribunal?" "Probably not." He returned his attention to the cultivation frames. "To you, I think it might." The settlement's inhabitants began including her in their routines, without explicit invitation. Someone would gesture toward an empty seat during communal meals. Children would bring her objects they'd found, shells, pieces of metal, fragments of the world before, and wait for her response with an expectation she couldn't quite interpret. Ellison watched these interactions from his usual peripheral position, and sometimes she caught something in his expression that her analysis flagged as significant without providing classification. "They're adopting you," he said one evening, when she'd spent 20 minutes examining a child's collection of colored glass worn smooth by the ocean. "I'm an observer. You're here. You show up every morning. You help with the cultivation. You listen when they talk." He paused. "That's enough." She processed this information against her understanding of human social structures. Her presence should have registered as temporary, transitional. She would deliver her judgment and depart. They should have maintained appropriate distance from someone whose role was evaluation. "They don't fear the judgment," she said, partly a question. "They've already survived the worst outcome they could imagine. What's left to fear?" He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body in the cooling evening air. You, though, what do you fear? The question should have been meaningless. Her people had evolved past fear, past the uncertainty that generated such primitive responses. But standing there surrounded by humans who had survived what should have killed them, she felt something her training had no category for. That my judgment will be wrong, she said quietly. His hand found hers in the darkness. Not the first time they'd touched, but the first time the contact felt like something other than practical necessity or observational documentation. Then maybe you're more human than you think, he said. The settlement's living structures were small, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Kael'vin had been provided with a space near the cultivation pools, a single room with basic amenities, and a sleeping platform she didn't technically require, but which humans seemed to expect her to use. Ellison's quarters were adjacent, separated by a thin wall through which she could register his movements, his breathing, the patterns of his sleeping and waking. She told herself the proximity was coincidental, efficient. The cultivation pools required constant monitoring, and both of them maintained the early schedule necessary for optimal harvest timing. But she had begun timing her own routines to match his, rising when she sensed him waking, moving to the pools as he emerged from his quarters, their paths intersecting in the pre-dawn darkness with a consistency that had no analytical justification. One morning he was waiting outside her door when she emerged. 2 cups of the hot beverage humans seemed to require for optimal morning function. You don't have to drink it, he said, offering her one of the cups, but you might want to feel the warmth. She accepted the cup, her sensors registering the heat transfer, the aromatic compounds rising with the steam. Humans consumed this for stimulation, for comfort, for the ritual of shared preparation and consumption. They walked to the pools together in silence, the settlement still dark around them, the ocean a constant rhythm of sound and movement. She held the cup carefully, feeling the warmth against her palms, aware of him beside her, in ways her instruments couldn't adequately measure. When I was younger, he said quietly, I thought understanding systems meant controlling them. If I could map all the variables, predict all the outcomes, I could create perfect equilibrium. She waited, sensing he was offering something more than casual conversation. Took me 3 decades to realize the systems I was studying were interesting specifically because they resisted perfect prediction. The chaos was the point, not a problem to solve. He stopped at the pool's edge, looking out at the water. Your people chose control, perfect prediction, no uncertainty. Optimal stability, she confirmed, and you've been standing at the edge of these pools for weeks, learning patterns you can't predict, participating in a system you can't control. He turned toward her. Why? Her processing cascaded through layers of protocol, training, evolutionary conditioning. She should have maintained analytical distance, should have documented without engaging, should have preserved the certainty her species had built their entire civilization upon. Because, she said slowly, the chaos is the point. The morning Ellison reached for her hand without practical justification, something in Kael'vin's processing architecture recognized the moment as significant. They were standing in the cultivation pools, water cool around their legs, the sun not yet breaking the horizon. His fingers touched hers beneath the surface, a contact that registered in her sensory nodes with unexpected clarity. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice carrying frequencies her translator flagged as important. Before your judgment comes due. She waited, aware of the warmth of his hand against hers, the rhythm of his pulse where their skin connected. I was married, he began, before the collapse. Had a research partner who understood systems the way I did. We were going to map the entire coastal ecosystem, document everything before climate change altered it beyond recognition. He paused, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. She died in the first wave, the atmospheric cascade. Her biology didn't adapt fast enough. Kael'vin processed this information against everything she knew about human pair bonding, loss, grief. Her people had evolved past such attachments, past the vulnerability that made loss devastating. I stopped believing in prediction after that, he continued. Spent a year thinking if I'd just mapped one more variable, run one more model, I could have saved her. But systems don't work that way. Life doesn't work that way. His hand moved against hers, a gesture her instruments couldn't classify. These pools, this settlement, Everything we're doing here, it's all chaos pretending to be pattern. We adapt because we have to, not because we understand the mechanisms. And I think—" He turned toward her, and in the pre-dawn darkness she could sense the full focus of his attention. "I think that terrifies your people more than they'll ever admit." She should have maintained protocol distance, should have processed his statement as observational data. But his hand was warm against hers, his presence creating patterns in her sensory input that her training had no framework for, and she felt something her people had chosen to evolve past. The recognition that uncertainty might be more valuable than certainty, that chaos might teach what prediction could not. "Yes," she said quietly, "it terrifies us." The message from the tribunal arrived 48 hours before her judgment was due. Preliminary data suggests non-compliance with standard preservation protocols. Accelerate assessment timeline. Submit recommendation within 2 cycles. Ellison read the directive 3 times, her processing architecture struggling with response patterns that felt increasingly unfamiliar. The tribunal wanted certainty, wanted her to categorize humanity's trajectory as viable or non-viable, to recommend intervention or independence, to reduce 4,000 human lives and 4 years of impossible adaptation into a binary decision. She found Ellison in the cultivation pools, as always. The morning light caught in the water around his hands, refracting into spectra her eyes could perceive, but her people had learned to ignore as informationally redundant. He looked up when she approached, and something in his expression suggested he already knew. "They want your recommendation," he said. It was not a question. She stood at the pool's edge, close enough to feel the spray against her dermal layer, close enough to register the heat and rhythm of his presence. "My analysis indicates your population cannot sustain itself without technological intervention," she said, using the formal language of tribunal reports. "The degradation patterns are irreversible. Within 3 generations, genetic damage will exceed repair capacity." "But we're still here," he said quietly, "still adapting. Your models didn't predict that either." She had documented 17 distinct adaptations, cellular innovations that emerged too rapidly for standard evolutionary mechanisms. Her xenobiologists had proposed theories, but none adequately explained the speed or specificity of the changes. "The tribunal requires certainty," she said, "projection, guarantee." Ellison moved through the water toward her, emerging from the pool with his clothes clinging to his frame, water streaming from his hair and skin. He stopped close enough that she could feel the chill coming off him, the way his body worked to restore thermal equilibrium, close enough that if she extended her sensory nodes fully, they would brush against him. "What do you fear?" he asked, his voice low, intense. "Not your tribunal. You. What makes you stand at the edge instead of making contact?" Her processing cascaded through layers of protocol, training, evolutionary conditioning. Her people had eliminated uncertainty, had built a civilization on predictable patterns and controlled variables. They had encountered hundreds of species, catalogued them, preserved them, guided them toward stable states. But they had never encountered something that changed faster than they could measure, that generated complexity instead of resolving toward equilibrium. She reached toward him, her hand trembling slightly with the effort of overriding her trained responses. Her fingers touched his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart, the rise and fall of his breathing, the warmth of living tissue burning through resources without hesitation or efficiency. Beneath her touch, she felt something her instruments had never captured, the absolute commitment of his biology to continuation, the refusal encoded in every cell to accept predicted failure. His hand covered hers, pressing it more firmly against his chest. The contact flooded her sensory nodes with data her people had no frameworks to process. The desperate resilience of a species that had survived its own near extinction. The terrifying possibility that adaptation might be more powerful than prediction. "If I recommend intervention," she said, her voice carrying harmonics she had not intended, "they will save you. Perfect environments, controlled reproduction, elimination of all stressors. And we'll stop changing," he said. "Stop adapting. Become what you think we should be instead of what we're becoming." Her entire species had chosen that path, had traded the chaos of uncontrolled evolution for the security of managed stability. They no longer changed, no longer surprised themselves, no longer carried the terrible uncertainty of not knowing what they might become. They were safe, perfect, complete, and they were terrified of anything that suggested their choice might not be the only viable path. Ellison spent the night in the observation chamber of the tribunal ship, reviewing data she had already analyzed dozens of times: population projections, genetic degradation models, resource sustainability calculations. Every analysis pointed toward the same conclusion. Humanity's trajectory was unsustainable without intervention. The certainty should have been comforting. Her people valued clarity, precision, the elimination of ambiguity. She had 43 previous judgments to reference, each one delivered with appropriate confidence and accepted without question. But her sensory nodes kept returning to other data: the warmth of Ellison's hand against hers, the rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm, the way the settlement's children had brought her their treasures with absolute trust that she would understand their value, the way she had learned to separate algae filaments by texture rather than instrumental analysis, the way she had begun timing her routines to intersect with his, the way uncertainty had begun to feel less like failure and more like possibility. She returned to the settlement at dawn, finding Ellison already in the cultivation pools. He looked up when she approached, water dripping from his hands, and waited without speaking. "I've made my preliminary assessment," she said. He nodded slowly, his expression neutral. "My analysis indicates intervention is necessary for survival." Something shifted in his posture. Not quite tension, not quite surrender. "When do they come?" "They don't." She moved closer, close enough to feel the spray from the pool against her dermal layer. "I'm recommending independent designation." His eyes widened slightly. "That contradicts your analysis." "Yes. The tribunal will question—" "I know." He stood there in the water, studying her with an intensity that made her sensory nodes fluctuate. Why? She had been processing this question throughout the night, running through layers of justification and protocol. But the answer, when she finally articulated it, was simpler than all her complex analysis. "Because your species is teaching mine something we thought we'd evolved past." She paused. "That chaos and resilience might offer possibilities. Certainty cannot." The tribunal's response arrived within hours. Preliminary recommendation rejected, insufficient justification, additional analysis required, judgment timeline extended indefinitely pending review. Ellison read the message in her quarters, her processing architecture struggling with response patterns that felt increasingly alien to her training. The tribunal had never rejected one of her judgments before, had never questioned her analysis, had never demanded justification beyond data. She should have felt concern, anxiety, the emotional contamination her people had evolved past. Instead, she felt something her language had no adequate term for, a recognition that she had chosen chaos over certainty, and that the choice had cost her the identity she'd constructed over 4 decades of service. Ellison found her sitting outside her quarters as the sun set, staring at the ocean without really seeing it. "They didn't accept it," he said. "Not a question." "No." He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "What happens now?" "Additional review. Extended observation period. Eventually another evaluator, who will deliver the judgment the tribunal expects." "And you?" She turned toward him, studying the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the evidence of a life lived without certainty or controlled stability. "I don't know." He reached for her hand, his palm warm against hers. "That's a start." They sat in silence as darkness gathered, the ocean constant below them, the settlement's sounds a rhythm she had learned without conscious intention. She felt the warmth of his skin, the steady pulse of his heartbeat where their hands connected, the data her sensory nodes collected and her processing architecture struggled to classify. "When I lost my wife," he said quietly, "I thought I'd lost my ability to connect to anything. Spent a year moving through routines without really being present. The cultivation pools were just data. The other survivors were just population statistics." He paused, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "But systems don't work without connection. Ecosystems fail when the relationships between organisms break down. And I realized I had to choose. Remain isolated and certain of my grief or risk connection, and accept the uncertainty of what that might cost me." She processed this against her own transformation. The way proximity to him had altered her fundamental understanding of her role, her purpose, her identity. "You chose chaos," she said. "I chose to feel again." He turned toward her. "Even though I knew it would hurt. Even though I couldn't predict the outcome." Her dermal layer responded with fluctuations she was beginning to recognize as something her people's language had deliberately excluded. Not quite desire, not quite need. Something that existed in the space between certainty and possibility. "I violated every protocol my species holds essential," she said quietly. "I know. The tribunal will eventually replace me. We'll send an evaluator who maintains appropriate analytical distance. I know. I can't predict what happens next." He smiled slightly, his thumb moving against the back of her hand. "Welcome to being human." The extended observation period became something Ellison couldn't adequately classify. Not quite judgment, not quite participation. Something that existed in the uncertain space between observer and observed. She continued working in the cultivation pools each morning, her hands learning patterns Ellison had taught her, her sensory nodes adjusting to rhythms her instruments couldn't measure. The settlement's inhabitants had stopped treating her as temporary, including her in their routines with the same casual expectation they showed each other. Children brought her their discoveries. Adults asked her opinion on water quality and harvest timing. Someone had added a cushion to her usual seat at communal meals without comment or ceremony. She was being absorbed into their system, she realized, integrated into their patterns of survival and adaptation. And the integration felt less like contamination and more like evolution. "You're changing," Ellison observed one morning, both of them waist-deep in the cultivation pools, working in the synchronized rhythm they'd developed over months of proximity. "Adaptive response," she said, using the clinical language of her species. "Connection," he corrected gently. "You're allowing yourself to be connected." She processed this assessment against her understanding of her own transformation. Her people had eliminated connection in favor of certainty, had built a civilization on isolation and perfect prediction. But standing in the water beside him, their movements synchronized without conscious coordination, she felt something her training had no framework for. The recognition that connection might be more valuable than certainty. That relationship might teach what isolation could not. His hand found hers beneath the water, a contact that had become ritual without either of them acknowledging it explicitly. Her sensory nodes registered the warmth of his skin, the pulse of his heartbeat, the minute tremors that indicated living tissue in constant motion. "The new evaluator will arrive eventually," she said quietly. "I know. They'll deliver the judgment the tribunal expects. Probably. We can't change that outcome." He turned toward her, water dripping from his hair, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her dermal layer respond with fluctuations she no longer tried to suppress. "No," he said, "but we can change what it means to us." The notification arrived at dawn. Replacement evaluator en route. Estimated arrival 6 hours. Transfer all documentation and prepare for departure. Ellison stood in her quarters, reading the message 3 times, her processing architecture struggling with response patterns that felt entirely foreign to the entity she'd been when she first descended to this damaged world. She should have felt relief. Release from an assignment that had violated every protocol her species held essential. Return to the certainty and stability her people had built their civilization upon. Instead, she felt loss. She found Ellison in the cultivation pools, as always. The morning light caught in the water around his hands, creating patterns she had learned to read as indicators of water quality, algae health, system stability. He looked up when she approached, and something in his expression suggested he already knew. "They're sending your replacement," he said. "Yes. When do you leave?" 6 hours. He stood there in the water, his hands still, his attention focused entirely on her. "Will you go back? To your people?" She processed the question against everything she had learned during these months of observation, participation, connection. Her species would accept her return, would classify her contamination as correctable, would guide her back toward the certainty she had abandoned. But standing there, looking at Ellison in the morning light, surrounded by a settlement of humans who had survived what should have killed them, she felt something her training had no category for, the recognition that she had already made her choice. that her judgment had never really been about humanity's viability, that the transformation she'd undergone was irreversible. "No," she said quietly. His eyes widened slightly. "They won't allow— I'm not asking permission." She moved toward the pool's edge, her hands entering the water beside his. "My preliminary judgment stands. Humanity should be designated for independent evolution. My species' intervention would destroy what makes you viable. The tribunal will reject that recommendation." "I know." She paused, her sensory nodes registering the warmth of his presence, the rhythm of his breathing, the data her instruments couldn't adequately classify. "But I'm no longer concerned with what the tribunal will accept." He reached for her hand beneath the water, his grip warm and certain. "What are you concerned with?" She looked at their joined hands, at the cultivation frames they'd tended together, at the settlement beyond where humans moved through their impossible routines of survival and adaptation. "With participating," she said, "with connection, with accepting the uncertainty of not knowing what comes next." He pulled her closer, close enough that she could feel his breath against her dermal layer, close enough that her sensory nodes flooded with data about pulse and temperature and the electromagnetic patterns his nervous system generated. "That's terrifying," he said quietly. "Yes. Your people will consider you contaminated. Compromised. Yes. You can't go back to what you were." "No." She met his eyes, allowing her dermal layer to respond fully to his proximity, to the warmth and rhythm and chaos of his presence. "But I think I've discovered what my species fears. That chaos and resilience might offer possibilities certainty cannot. That connection might be more valuable than perfect prediction." His hand moved to her face, his palm warm against her skin, his touch careful and deliberate. "What do you want?" The question should have been impossible to answer. Her people had evolved past wanting, past the uncertainty that made desire meaningful. But standing in the cultivation pools at dawn, surrounded by evidence of humanity's impossible survival, she felt something her training had no framework for. "To stay," she said, "to continue participating, to learn what adaptation really means." He smiled then, and the expression carried data her instruments couldn't measure, but her sensory nodes registered as essential. "The new evaluator will deliver their judgment, will recommend intervention. Probably. Your people will come. Will offer relocation and preservation. Yes. And we'll refuse. Again. Yes." He drew her closer, his arms encircling her, his body warm against hers. Her sensory nodes flooded with information. Pulse, respiration, body heat, the electromagnetic patterns of neural activity, all the chaotic data her people had learned to ignore as informationally redundant. But standing in his embrace, she understood what her species had abandoned. That chaos contained meaning certainty could not measure. That connection generated possibilities prediction could not anticipate. That uncertainty might be the only honest response to a universe that refused perfect categorization. Above them, the sun broke the horizon, light refracting through the water in patterns that had no analytical significance, but which she had learned to perceive as beautiful. Around them, the settlement stirred into morning routines she had become part of without conscious decision. And in his arms, she felt the rhythm of a biology that refused every logic her civilization was built upon. The new evaluator would arrive in hours, would deliver the judgment the tribunal expected, would classify humanity as non-viable without intervention. But Ellison had discovered something her species feared to acknowledge, that some questions had answers certainty could not safely comprehend, that chaos and resilience might be more valuable than perfect prediction. That connection might teach what isolation could not. She had delivered her judgment, though not in the form the tribunal would accept. And in choosing chaos over certainty, connection over isolation, she had found something her people had evolved past. She had found the courage to become something she couldn't predict,